Late on a Thursday evening, just past 11:30 p.m., a woman named Sarah Thompson ordered a ride home after a night out with friends. It was supposed to be a quick, uneventful trip, a routine she had followed countless times before. But this time, something went terribly wrong. Sarah, a 28-year-old marketing executive, had been at a downtown bar with colleagues, celebrating the successful launch of a new campaign. The atmosphere was lively, the drinks flowed, and the laughter echoed in the dimly lit room. As the night wore on, the group began to dwindle, with people heading home in pairs or alone. By 11:15 p.m., Sarah found herself alone, her friends already gone. It was time to call it a night. She opened her ride-hailing app, requesting a car to take her to her apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes away. The app showed a driver nearby, and within a minute, she received a notification. Your driver, Kevin, is on the way. The car was a white sedan, a model she recognized as common for such services. She watched the small icon on her phone screen as the car approached her location. At 11:32 p.m., the car pulled up to the curb. The driver's profile picture matched the face behind the wheel, and the license plate was correct. Reassured, Sarah got in, thanking the driver as she settled into the back seat. Kevin, a man in his early 40s with thinning hair and a polite smile, greeted her. The car smelled faintly of air freshener, and the radio played soft jazz. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But as they pulled away from the curb, Sarah began to notice small, almost imperceptible differences. The driver's behavior was slightly off. Kevin was quieter than most drivers she had encountered, offering no small talk beyond the initial greeting. He didn't ask her how her night had been or whether the temperature in the car was comfortable. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The first inkling of discomfort came when Sarah realized the car's interior was not as clean as she expected. The ride-hailing service she used was known for maintaining a certain standard, but the back seat had crumbs on the floor, and the faint smell of stale cigarettes lingered beneath the scent of the air freshener. She glanced at the back of the driver's seat, noticing a small tear in the upholstery that looked hastily patched with duct tape. It was strange, but not alarming. She dismissed it as an oversight, perhaps an older car that hadn't been cleaned properly. As they drove through the quiet streets, Sarah began to feel uneasy. The route Kevin was taking seemed slightly off. She was familiar with the area, and though there were multiple ways to reach her apartment, the turns he made didn't align with the usual path. She leaned forward slightly, checking the route on her phone. The map showed that they were still heading in the right direction, but the deviation was enough to make her question it. "Is this a shortcut?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying a hint of anxiety. Kevin didn't turn around. "Yeah, traffic's usually lighter this way," he replied, his tone flat and emotionless. But there was no traffic at this hour, and Sarah knew it. Something about his response, or perhaps the lack of explanation, set off alarm bells in her mind. The tension in the car grew. Sarah tried to keep calm, convincing herself that she was overreacting. After all, he had the correct license plate and matched the profile picture. But the unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing minute. She subtly checked the child safety locks on the doors, finding them engaged. Panic flickered in her chest as she realized that she couldn't open the door from the inside. The car slowed to a stop at a red light, and Sarah's heart raced as she considered her options. She could confront the driver, but what if she was wrong? What if he was just an awkward, quiet man trying to do his job? The light turned green, and the car moved forward again, taking another unfamiliar turn. Sarah's phone vibrated with a text message from a friend checking in. She opened it, using the opportunity to share her location in a message. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice firmer this time, the anxiety now unmistakable. Kevin glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and unreadable. "Don't worry, we're almost there," he said. But the words felt hollow, like a promise he had no intention of keeping. The car turned onto a deserted road, lined with trees and no streetlights. Sarah's pulse quickened, and her breathing became shallow. The houses were spaced far apart, their lights off, the occupants likely asleep. She knew she had to act and fast. "I think you took a wrong turn," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This isn't the way to my apartment." The driver didn't respond. Instead, he pressed down on the accelerator, the car picking up speed. Sarah's panic surged as she frantically looked for a way out. The windows were locked, and the child's safety locks meant the doors wouldn't open from the inside. Her mind raced, desperately trying to think of a way to escape. Without warning, Sarah lunged forward, reaching for the steering wheel. Kevin reacted swiftly, slamming on the brakes and throwing the car into a skid. Sarah was thrown back into her seat, her body slamming against the door. The car came to a sudden stop in the middle of the road. The silence deafening. Kevin turned around slowly, his face twisted into a menacing sneer. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and threatening. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the full extent of the danger she was in. Fear gave way to determination. As Kevin unbuckled his seatbelt and started to reach for something under his seat, Sarah acted on pure instinct. She unlocked her phone, dialing 911 as quickly as her shaking fingers allowed. She didn't wait for a response before she started screaming into the phone. "Help! I'm being kidnapped. He's trying to." The phone was ripped from her hand and thrown to the floor. Kevin's face was inches from hers, his breath hot and rancid. "Shut up," he snarled, his hand closing around her throat. Sarah clawed at his fingers, struggling to breathe, her vision blurring at the edges. She kicked wildly, her foot connecting with his chest, pushing him back just enough to break his grip. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah reached for the door handle on the opposite side. It was locked, but in her frantic movements, she managed to find the manual lock switch. She pulled it up, and the door clicked open. Without thinking, she threw herself out of the car, hitting the pavement hard. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her knees bruised and bleeding, and ran as fast as she could. He didn't look back, didn't care where she was going, as long as it was away from him. The road seemed endless, the trees a dark blur as she sprinted through the night. The sound of footsteps pounding behind her sent fresh waves of terror through her, but she kept running, fueled by sheer survival instinct. In the distance, she saw headlights approaching. It was a car, a lifeline in the darkness. She waved her arms wildly, screaming for help. The car slowed as it neared, and she recognized the unmistakable blue and red lights of a police vehicle. Relief washed over her as she collapsed onto the road, her body trembling uncontrollably. The officers jumped out of the car, one of them rushing to her side while the other shone a flashlight down the road. Sarah pointed back towards the direction she had come from, her voice hoarse from screaming. "He's back there. He tried to kill me." The officers quickly moved into action, one staying with Sarah while the other ran back to the patrol car, radioing for backup. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness. They searched the area, combing the woods and the road, but Kevin was gone. The white sedan was found abandoned a few miles away, the interior ransacked, with no trace of the man who had driven it. Sarah was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for her injuries and kept under observation for the night. The following day, she gave her statement to the police, recounting the terrifying events in as much detail as she could remember. The investigation that followed was swift but inconclusive. Kevin, if that was even his real name, was never found. The ride-hailing company cooperated fully with the authorities, providing all the information they had on the driver, but it led to a dead end. The account had been created using stolen identification, and the car had been reported stolen just hours before Sarah's ride. The case sent shockwaves through the community, a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in even the most mundane situations. For weeks, local news stations ran stories about the incident, warning people to be vigilant and always double-check their rides. The police urged anyone with information to come forward, but no new leads emerged. Sarah, traumatized by the experience, struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. The psychological scars ran deep, and for a long time she couldn't bring herself to use a ride-hailing service again. She moved to a new apartment in a different part of town, hoping to leave the memories behind, but the fear lingered. Every time she saw a white sedan, her heart would race, and she would instinctively look over her shoulder, searching for the face of the man who had almost taken her life. The imposter driver remained at large, his whereabouts unknown. He became the subject of urban legends and online forums, a nameless predator who had slipped through the cracks. The police continued their search, but as the weeks turned into months and then years, the case grew cold. It was a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we imagine, but the ones who walk among us, hiding in plain sight. The case of the imposter driver remains open, a chilling unsolved mystery that continues to haunt those who remember it. Sarah Thompson eventually moved on with her life, but the events of that night left an indelible mark on her psyche. She became an advocate for ride-hailing safety, sharing her story to raise awareness and push for better safety measures in the industry. But every so often, in the quiet moments when she is alone, Sarah wonders where Kevin is now. Is he still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim? The thought sends a shiver down her spine, a reminder that evil can strike when we least expect it, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we never see coming. On a cold Saturday night in October, Daniel Weaver hailed a rideshare after a lively evening out with friends. The 32-year-old software engineer had spent the night at his favorite bar in the heart of the city, unwinding after a long work week. The mood had been light, the drinks abundant, and by the time he stepped outside to head home, it was well past midnight. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into the early hours of the morning. Daniel pulled out his phone, ordered a ride, and watched the screen as a driver was assigned. The car was a black SUV. The driver's name was Paul, and the estimated arrival time was just 3 minutes. Daniel leaned against the building, rubbing his hands together to fend off the chill, his breath visible in the crisp air. At exactly 12:15 a.m., the SUV pulled up. The license plate matched, and the driver's profile photo was accurate. Paul, a man in his mid-40s with a salt and pepper beard and a heavy-set frame, gave Daniel a nod through the open window. Daniel got in, greeted the driver with a casual "hey," and settled into the back seat. The car's interior was immaculate, a scent of leather mingling with the faint aroma of mint. The dashboard was spotless, and the soft hum of the engine was barely audible. Paul seemed professional enough, polite but reserved, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as he pulled away from the curb. Daniel, slightly tipsy but not drunk, leaned back and let his eyes close, trusting the familiar routine of the rideshare. As they drove through the dimly lit streets, Daniel felt a sense of calm, his thoughts drifting. But that calm was shattered when he noticed something peculiar. The car wasn't heading in the direction of his apartment. The streets they were passing were unfamiliar, leading them away from the city center and into a more desolate area. Daniel sat up, his mind sharpening with a sudden surge of unease. He glanced at his phone, checking the map on the app. The route indicated they were going the wrong way. His apartment was to the north, but Paul was driving south. "Hey, I think you took a wrong turn," Daniel said, his voice edged with confusion. Paul didn't respond immediately. He continued driving, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. After a moment, he spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm. "No, Daniel, I'm taking you exactly where you need to go." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The tone in Paul's voice was unnerving, laced with a certainty that sent alarms ringing in Daniel's head. He forced a chuckle, trying to mask his growing anxiety. "Okay, seriously, you're going the wrong way. Just take the next turn and head back." Paul ignored him, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The car accelerated, the buildings becoming sparser as they drove deeper into an industrial area. The streets were empty, devoid of traffic or pedestrians. Daniel's heart began to pound in his chest, his mind racing with questions. Why was the driver doing this? Where was he taking him? "Let me out, man," Daniel demanded, his voice rising in panic. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The doors were locked, and the child safety locks were engaged, trapping him inside. Paul glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "You're not getting out, Daniel. Not until I've had my say." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. There was something sinister in those words, something that made his skin crawl. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. Paul's expression didn't change. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Daniel stared at the man in the mirror, trying to recall if they had met before, but nothing came to mind. "I don't know you," he replied, his voice shaky. "Just let me out, and we can forget this ever happened." Paul's lips curled into a faint smile. There was no warmth in it. "Oh, you know me, Daniel. You just don't remember, but I remember you. I've been watching you for months, waiting for this moment." Fear gripped Daniel, squeezing his chest like a vice. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul's eyes flickered with something dark, something that sent a jolt of terror through Daniel. "I want you to understand," he said, his voice low and measured. "I want you to understand what you did and why you're going to pay for it." Words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Daniel's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented clues. Had he wronged this man in some way? Couldn't remember, couldn't think of anything that would lead to this. Paul continued driving, the city lights fading into the distance as they ventured further into the industrial wasteland. The streets were lined with abandoned warehouses and factories, their windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. It was a part of the city Daniel had never been to, a place where the forgotten and the forsaken dwelled. As the car turned down a narrow alleyway, Paul began to speak again. "You think you can just go through life doing whatever you want and there won't be any consequences? You think people like me don't matter, that we're just obstacles in your path?" Daniel's confusion deepened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, just let me go. I'll give you whatever you want. Money, anything." Paul let out a bitter laugh. "Money? You think this is about money?" "No, Daniel. This is about your sins, the things you've done that you think you've gotten away with." The car came to a stop in front of an old, dilapidated building. Paul turned off the engine and twisted in his seat to face Daniel. "You're going to listen to me now," he said, his voice filled with a quiet rage. "And when I'm done, you're going to pay for what you've done." Daniel's heart raced as he realized the full extent of the danger he was in. He was trapped in a car with a man who clearly had a vendetta against him, and there was no one around to help. Paul reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He flipped it open, revealing pages filled with scribbled notes and photographs. Daniel's stomach churned as he recognized the faces in those photos, his friends, his family, even himself. The pictures were candid, taken without his knowledge, capturing moments from his daily life. There were images of him at work, out with friends, even entering and leaving his apartment building. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Paul had been stalking him, following his every move, learning everything there was to know about him. Paul pointed to a specific photo, one that showed Daniel with his arm around a woman outside a restaurant. "Her name was Emily," Paul said, his voice laced with pain. "You dated her for a few months last year, didn't you?" Daniel's mouth went dry as he looked at the photo. He remembered Emily. She was someone he had casually dated, but the relationship hadn't gone anywhere. They had parted on friendly terms, or so he thought. "She was my sister," Paul said, his voice breaking. "My little sister. She meant everything to me." Daniel's mind reeled. Emily had never mentioned having a brother, let alone one as intense and unhinged as the man sitting in the driver's seat. "I didn't know," Daniel stammered. "She never told me about you." "She didn't have to," Paul replied, his voice bitter. "She trusted you, and you broke her heart. She fell apart after you ended things. I had to watch her spiral into depression, listen to her cry herself to sleep every night, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. You destroyed her, and you didn't even care." Daniel felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had ended things with Emily because he didn't see a future with her, but he never intended to hurt her. He never knew she had suffered so much after their breakup. "Paul, I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know she felt that way. I didn't mean to hurt her." Paul's eyes blazed with fury. "Sorry isn't enough, Daniel. You moved on with your life like nothing happened, while Emily was left picking up the pieces, and now she's gone." Daniel's heart sank. "What do you mean she's gone?" "She killed herself 6 months ago," Paul said, his voice flat. "She couldn't take the pain anymore, and she took her own life, and it's your fault." Daniel felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. The weight of Paul's words crashed down on him, leaving him breathless. He hadn't known, hadn't realized the impact his actions had on Emily. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was something else, fear of what Paul might do next. Paul's hand tightened around the notebook. "I've been watching you, Daniel, learning everything about you. I wanted to understand what kind of person could do that to someone they claimed to care about. And the more I learned, the more disgusted I became." Flipped through the pages, revealing more photos, more notes. "You're a liar, cheat. You've used people, taken advantage of them, and left them behind without a second thought. You hurt Emily, but she wasn't the first, was she?" Daniel's pulse quickened as he recognized some of the other faces in the photos. ex-girlfriends, colleagues, even old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. Paul had documented everything, every misstep, every mistake, every moment of weakness. "You've left a trail of broken hearts and shattered lives in your wake," Paul continued, his voice cold. "And now it's time for you to face the consequence." Daniel's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. He had to find a way to talk Paul down, convince him to let him go. "Paul, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this isn't the way. Killing me won't bring Emily back. It won't fix anything." Paul's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm going to kill you?" Shook his head. "No, Daniel. Death is too easy. I want you to suffer the way Emily suffered. I want you to feel the pain, the despair, the hopelessness that she felt." Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the seat. He was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a man who had nothing left to lose. He had to keep him talking, had to find a way to survive this. "What are you going to do to me?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul's smile returned, cruel and twisted. "You'll see soon enough." He opened the driver's door and got out, walking around to the back of the SUV. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Paul open the trunk. He couldn't see what he was doing, but the sound of metal clinking together sent a jolt of fear through him. Moments later, Paul returned, holding a roll of duct tape and a pair of handcuffs. Daniel's blood ran cold as he realized what was about to happen. "Please, don't do this," he begged, voice cracking. "I'll do anything you want. Just let me go." Paul ignored him, his expression devoid of empathy. He reached into the car and grabbed Daniel's arm, yanking him out of the back seat with a force that sent him stumbling. Before Daniel could react, Paul had him pinned against the side of the SUV, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists as they were snapped shut. Daniel struggled, but Paul was stronger. Fueled by a rage that gave him the upper hand, he forced Daniel to the ground, wrapping the duct tape around his ankles, binding them together. Daniel's heart raced, his mind spiraling into panic as he realized he was completely at Paul's mercy. Paul stood over him, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You're going to know what it's like to be powerless," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're going to know what it's like to have your life taken away from you." He grabbed Daniel by the collar, dragging him across the gravelly ground towards the building. Daniel tried to resist, but his efforts were futile. He was no match for Paul's strength or his unrelenting determination. The building was dark and foreboding, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. Paul kicked open a rusted door, revealing a dimly lit room that smelled of mildew and decay. The floor was covered in dust, the air thick with the stench of rot. Paul threw Daniel onto the floor, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He tried to sit up, but Paul was on him in an instant, pressing him down with a booted foot on his chest. Daniel gasped for air, pressure unbearable. "Remember this moment, Daniel," Paul said, his voice cold and detached. "Remember what it feels like to have no control, be at the mercy of someone else. This is what you did to Emily, and now it's your turn." Daniel's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He was trapped, helpless, and completely at the mercy of a man who wanted nothing more than to see him suffer. The fear was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that crushed his spirit. But in the back of his mind, a small spark of hope remained. He had to survive this, had to find a way out. He couldn't let Paul win. Paul stepped back, his eyes never leaving Daniel as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a syringe. The sight of it sent a wave of terror through Daniel, and he thrashed against his restraints, desperation fueling his movements. But it was no use. Paul was relentless, pinning Daniel down as he plunged the needle into his arm. The cold liquid coursed through his veins, sending a wave of dizziness crashing over him. Daniel's vision darkened, his body growing heavy as the drug took hold. The last thing he saw was Paul's face, twisted with a mixture of satisfaction and hatred, before everything went black. When Daniel awoke, he was lying on the floor of the abandoned building, his body aching, his mind foggy. He had no idea how much time had passed, but the sun was beginning to rise, its weak rays filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Paul was gone, the SUV was gone, and Daniel was left alone, bruised, battered, and broken. He managed to free himself from the duct tape and handcuffs, but the emotional scars would never heal. The police found him hours later, wandering the streets in a daze, unable to remember much of what had happened after Paul injected him. The investigation that followed uncovered Paul's identity, a man who had lived in the shadows, fueled by a twisted need for revenge after his sister's death. But Paul was never found, vanishing without a trace, leaving Daniel to live in fear, always looking over his shoulder, haunted by the night when a simple ride home turned into a nightmare. The case remained open, a dark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers, from those who know us all too well. James Lockwood's hands trembled as he steered his car down the empty streets, the fog still thick and oppressive around him. His mind was a whirl of fear and confusion, unable to fully process the events of the past hour. He had stopped at the first safe location he could find, a well-lit gas station with a convenience store that was open 24/7. He parked the car and stepped out, needing to clear his head and collect himself. The air outside was cold, the dampness clinging to his skin as he walked into the store. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a harsh, artificial glow that did little to alleviate the eerie feeling that had settled over him. James approached the counter, where a tired-looking clerk stood, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, can I use your phone?" James asked, his voice rough. "I need to call the police." The clerk looked up, his expression skeptical. "You all right, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." James rubbed his face, trying to gather his thoughts. "I just need to report something. It's urgent." The clerk handed over the phone, and James dialed 911. As he waited for the call to connect, he glanced around the store, his nerves on edge. The fog outside seemed to seep into every corner, amplifying his sense of isolation. When the dispatcher answered, James tried to explain what had happened, but his words came out in a disjointed, panicked jumble. He spoke about the strange messages, a passenger who looked like someone from his past, and his fear that he was being set up for something far more sinister than he could comprehend. James's call with the dispatcher was cut short as the police arrived at the gas station, their blue and red lights cutting through the fog like beacons of reassurance. He met them outside, his relief evident as he explained the situation again. This time, he had more composure, though his voice still trembled with anxiety. The officers took his statement, their faces serious, as they listened to his account of the rideshare, the unsettling messages, and the passenger's eerie resemblance to someone from his past. They asked for his phone to examine the messages and any other evidence he might have. James handed it over, feeling a pang of vulnerability as he watched them scrutinize the device. One of the officers, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor named Officer Martinez, reviewed the messages. Her brow furrowed as she read through the disturbing texts. "This is unsettling," she said, her voice tight with concern. "We'll need to look into this further. We'll also have to run a check on any possible leads regarding the passenger and the number that sent the messages." James nodded, feeling a growing sense of dread. He watched as the officers collected evidence and took photographs of the car. He felt like an intruder in his own life, his past coming back to haunt him in a way he never could have imagined. As the investigation unfolded, the police discovered that the unknown number used to send the messages was a disposable phone number. It had been used only for a short time and was now deactivated, leaving no trace of its origin. The passenger's identity was equally elusive. No one had reported a missing person matching the description of the man who had sat in James's back seat. The days that followed were a blur for James. He tried to return to his routine, but the weight of the encounter hung over him like a dark cloud. Every car ride, every shadowy corner of the city seemed to remind him of that night. The fear of an unseen enemy waiting to strike was a constant, gnawing presence in his life. The police investigation turned up no concrete leads, and the case eventually went cold. The mystery of the passenger and the messages remained unsolved, leaving James with an unresolved nightmare. He found himself haunted by the possibility that someone out there knew his deepest secrets and was willing to use them to torment him. James's wife, Sarah, noticed the change in him. He had become distant, withdrawn, his once cheerful demeanor replaced by a pervasive sense of dread. She tried to offer comfort and support, but James struggled to open up about the full extent of what had happened. The fear of sharing too much, of revealing the darker aspects of his past, kept him silent. One evening, as James sat alone in their living room, he received a new message on his phone. The sender was unknown. The content was chillingly familiar. "You can't hide forever, James. Past always catches up." James's heart raced as he read the message. He had hoped that the ordeal was over, that he could put it behind him. But the message was a stark reminder that the terror was far from finished. He could feel the grip of fear tightening around him once more. Desperate, James turned to the only person he felt he could trust with the truth: Officer Martinez. He had kept her contact information after the investigation, hoping that if something else came up, he would be able to reach out. He called her and, after a brief conversation, agreed to meet at her office. When he arrived, he was greeted by Officer Martinez, who looked both relieved and concerned to see him. They sat down in a quiet conference room, the walls adorned with case files and photographs. "I received another message," James said, his voice low and filled with apprehension. He showed Officer Martinez the new text, and her expression grew more serious as she read it. "This is troubling," she said, her tone grim. "It suggests that whoever is behind this knows you're still scared, and they're using that to their advantage." James nodded, his anxiety palpable. "I don't understand why this is happening. What do they want from me?" Officer Martinez took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "It's possible that this is about more than just scaring you. If the messages are accurate, then whoever is doing this knows a lot about your past. They might be trying to manipulate or control you by exploiting your guilt and fear." James's hands clenched into fists. "But why? Why would someone go through all this trouble? And how do I stop it?" "We'll keep investigating," Officer Martinez assured him. "But in the meantime, I advise you to be vigilant. Watch for any signs of surveillance or suspicious activity. Make sure your home is secure, and be careful about sharing any personal information." James agreed, though the advice did little to ease his growing sense of paranoia. He left the police station feeling both hopeful and fearful. He knew he had to face his fears head-on, but the uncertainty of the situation made it difficult to find any sense of security. Over the next few weeks, James took Officer Martinez's advice to heart. He installed security cameras around his home and became hyper-aware of his surroundings. He avoided taking his rideshare car out for fear that it might be monitored or tampered with. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but he felt it was necessary to protect himself and his family. Despite his efforts, the messages continued to arrive sporadically, each one more unsettling than the last. "You're not safe. Your past will come back to haunt you. I know where you live. I can reach you whenever I want." James became increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone was watching him. The fear began to affect his daily life, causing rifts between him and his family. Sarah noticed the changes in him, the way he flinched at sudden noises and became withdrawn. Their once stable and loving relationship was now strained by the constant tension and unspoken fears. One evening, after another distressing message, James decided he couldn't live like this anymore. He needed answers, needed to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. He reached out to Officer Martinez again, requesting a meeting to discuss his next steps. When they met, James was determined. "I can't keep living in fear. I need to know who's behind this. I need to face whatever is coming." Officer Martinez looked at him with a mix of sympathy and concern. "I understand your frustration. We're doing everything we can, but this situation is complicated. The messages are designed to scare you, and that can be a powerful tool. But if you're willing to take risks, we might be able to flush out whoever is behind this." She outlined a plan to monitor James's home more closely and use decoy methods to draw out the perpetrator. It was a risky approach, but James was willing to try anything to end the torment. In the following days, the surveillance intensified. James's home was equipped with additional hidden cameras, and Officer Martinez's team set up a series of decoys, pretending to be James in various locations around the city. They hoped that by making it appear as though James was constantly on the move, they might provoke the stalker into revealing themselves. The plan worked. On a foggy night similar to the one when the ordeal began, the police received a tip about a suspicious individual seen lurking near James's home. They arrived swiftly and apprehended a man who fit the description of the person James had seen in his back seat. The man, when questioned, revealed that he was an investigator hired by a private entity with a vendetta against James. The entity, it turned out, was a former business partner who had been wronged by James years ago, a detail James had forgotten, but one that had festered into a personal vendetta. The investigators' mission was to unsettle James, to force him into a confrontation over old grievances. The entity behind it all had wanted to make James's life a living nightmare, hoping to drive him to the brink of insanity. With the perpetrator in custody and the truth revealed, James could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The messages stopped, and the police assured him that his home and family were now safe. Though the ordeal had been harrowing, James was grateful for the resolution and the end of the constant fear. In the weeks that followed, James worked to rebuild his life, striving to mend his relationships and regain a sense of normalcy. The past, though still a part of him, no longer held the same power it once did. The fog that had shadowed his life slowly began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism for the future. James Lockwood's ordeal was a stark reminder that sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, and that the darkness we try to leave behind can find new ways to torment us. But with courage and support, even the most terrifying of nightmares can be faced and eventually overcome.